I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on Justin Trudeau, your current Prime Minister, and your government in general.
I think he's appalling. Well, I think our Prime Minister is exactly what you would have been afraid of had you been properly afraid when he first put himself out on the scene. So this is when Justin Trudeau ran for office, I thought, I don't have any respect for what you're doing because you wouldn't be doing this if your father wasn't the most famous prime minister in Canada in the last 50 years. So you have a family name, Trudeau, and you're capitalizing on that. And that's, I would say, well, that shouldn't disqualify you from political office, but you should have earned your name before you dared to throw your hat in the ring. And there's no evidence whatsoever that he had earned his name. And there's certainly no evidence now. So I thought, well, I'm very suspicious of your character because you should have thought very long and hard about daring to run for political office on the strength of your name alone. It's a narcissistic and juvenile thing to do, but he did it. And then I thought, okay, well, it was time for a new government in Canada. It was time for a change. And despite the fact that it was an error in judgment to run in that manner, maybe you'll be credible. But then the first thing he did, and there was no excuse for this, and it set the tone for everything else that has happened, is he formulated his cabinet and he made it 50% women, despite the fact that only 26% of the elected representatives were women. And when pressed on that, he said, well, because it's 2015, which is a facile answer. His responsibility was to go through his members of parliament and to pick the most qualified people to do the hard work necessary to do a characterological and skills analysis of every single one of those people and pick the best people, regardless of their race, creed, color, or sex, period. And he didn't do that, and Canadians gave him a free pass. And that was a very bad idea because, well, first of all, because it was an abdication of responsibility. Second, because it was kowtowing to an ideological position. And third, because he stacked his cabinet with people who were ideologues who weren't qualified. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. The last budget, for example, the whole budget, the main theme of the budget is to address the inequitable situation between men and women, which doesn't even exist. So he's twisted the whole budget to solve a fictional problem with an ideological strategy.
It sounds very similar to what's going on here, where it's all about kind of targeted demographics and putting people in a position because they're women or because they're black, not because they're competent in that necessary position. And this has real world consequences for many people in South Africa. The last 9 years have been anything but sterling for the average South African, and particularly bad for the poor. Are you very optimistic about South Africa and what kind of a future we have?
I'm very pessimistic about your country. I think you guys are in for an absolute catastrophe over the next 10 years. I hate to say that, but this last bit of legislation with regards to the farmers' lands, that's really, really, really not good.
What do you think of the stories you've read about South Africa in the news in the last little while? It seems that we've cracked the nod in some quite important foreign papers when it comes to this discussion about expropriation of property without compensation.
Well, I was absolutely heartbroken, I would say, when I read the news from South Africa this week. I think it's politically expedient to do what your government is doing. I think it appeals to the worst in everyone. I understand that South Africa has extremely serious social problems and that inequality in South Africa is very, very high. And it's not obvious at all what to do about that. And it's clear that it's suboptimal. But to demolish the rule of law as a precursor to solving that problem only means that it's going to get way, way, way worse before it gets better. I mean, isn't it reasonable to think of Zimbabwe as an example? Is that an unreasonable comparison?
Well, Venezuela. I mean, the same people who would implement stupid, proven policies of destruction in South Africa would probably want to use Venezuela as an example, even though it's a lamentable, demonstrable failure in every which way. it doesn't seem that there's any ability to learn the lessons of history among leaders who are hell-bent on enforcing their ideology on the populace.
Well, I think it's a catastrophe, and I can't see how South Africans can be sleeping easily in their beds these days. So,
damage their children. You say it's far better to render beings in your care competent than to protect them. Do you think that parents today are more protective of their children than previous generations?
I would say that it looks like that, yes. I think there are complex reasons for that. I don't think that you can necessarily lay that at the feet of the parents. People are having fewer children, and they're having them later in life. And so I think both of those things, those are major demographic shifts, and I think that one of the consequences of that is that children's lives are much more organized than they used to be, which might have some advantages, but that also parents are more likely to overprotect. They're older and more cautious, and the children also don't have as many siblings, and of course siblings were part of the child raising process, and it's hard to be overprotected in some ways when you're competing with a bunch of siblings. So it's complicated, but I think that overprotection is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Rule 11 is do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Mm-hmm. This is a recurring theme in your book. If we are overprotective with our children, we will create weak individuals.
Well, you demolish people's resilience that way. I mean, life is difficult, and you cannot protect your children. What you can do is prepare them, and you can prepare them to be strong and courageous and truthful and resilient and reciprocal in their interactions with other people. And that means you equip them for what life will be, which is at minimum a series of difficult challenges, and often more than that, because of course people go through very difficult times in their lives. And a resilient person is capable of standing up to things in the face of fear and moving forward voluntarily, convinced of their own competence and ability to prevail. And so your primary goal as a parent, apart from facilitating your child's social desirability, which is a major obligation on your part, is to encourage your children and I mean that literally, to instill in them a sense of courage in the face of the difficulties of life, and not to protect them from that. We don't even want to be protected from those difficulties, because a major part of life and its meaning is the challenge that comes with confronting difficulties. So,
yeah. What do you want to say to those parents that allow their 8 or 9-year-old sons to sleep in their beds at night instead of sleeping in their own rooms?
Well, the first thing I would say about that is you might want to ask why you don't want privacy with your spouse. You know, the last thing you want to do is use your child as an excuse to not interact properly with your wife or your husband. There's all sorts of reasons that people allow their children to interfere with their relationship. And by 8 or 9, a child is more than capable of spending time on their own, and they need to do that anyways, because you don't want your child to be either unable to spend time alone or terrified of it. You also destroy to some degree their ability to cope on their own, but also their imagination by not requiring them to rely on themselves for their own, for self-calming and also for self-amusement. There's a rule when you're dealing with people who might be dependent, and this includes the situation where you're dealing with sick people or elderly people, and the rule is do not do anything for anyone that they can do for themselves, because you take away their competence by doing that.
I want to ask you about the use of physical force on children, because you think it is important to allow kids to explore and harm themselves to gain experience. Still, you believe strict parenting is important, and you think it is justifiable to flick the index finger on certain types of 2-year-olds. Why is the use of force justifiable in those situations?
Well, it depends on the context, and it also depends on what you mean by force. There isn't a disciplinary strategy that you can utilize that doesn't involve something that's unpleasant. Well, you can use reward, but there's different circumstances under which, and you should use reward every time you can because it's more effective. But you often need something that's instantaneous and that gets the message across. And a flick is a very good technique because it's instant, it's harmless, it gets the message across, you can use it publicly, it can't be misused, you won't hurt the child. You have to have an effective disciplinary strategy for use in social situations, for example.
Yeah, you're talking about the minimizing the use of...
Yeah, well, the basic rules are quite straightforward. Minimum number of rules, because otherwise the enforcement costs accrue, and you end up constraining yourself and the child too much. And then minimal necessary force. And you might ask, well, what's minimal necessary force? And the answer to that is minimum intervention necessary to bring the behavior to a halt as rapidly and harmlessly as possible. And that has to be negotiated with the child, because some children are much more difficult to stop than others.
But isn't it possible that the parent-child relationship can be damaged if basic trust and safety is lost?
Oh, it's absolutely the case that it will be damaged, yes. But the application of judicious disciplinary force doesn't damage the relationship, it actually strengthens it. And everyone knows this. Look, if you have a relationship with your wife, let's say, the relationship is partly based on mutual respect, not merely on mutual love. It's also based on mutual respect. And everyone tests out their partner to determine what their limits are. And if you're not subject to corrective action on the part of your partner, you will have no respect for them. Your relationship will just deteriorate very rapidly. So, and it's very important to understand that the limits that you place on children are not something that impede the child-parent relationship, but actually further it substantially.
I want to talk about gender equality now.
Yeah.
In chapter 11, you write about the so-called oppression of the patriarchy. And you
Yes.
write, it looks to me like the so-called oppression of the patriarchy was instead an imperfect collective attempt by men and women stretching over millennia to free each other from privation, disease, and drudgery. So the oppression of women happened because it was practical?
No, the oppression of men and women happened because life is difficult and treacherous. And so we were subject, and still are, to all sorts of terrible burdens that are intrinsic to life itself. I mean, one of the things that's happened is because we're so technically and materially wealthy right now, we don't understand what privations our ancestors, even a few generations ago, faced. I mean, it was very difficult for women to function, let's say, as technical equals in the absence of reliable control of menstruation. That's only been a reality for, say, 70 years. And the birth control pill as well is a major technological revolution.
You mentioned technological advancement.
Yes.
So the hurdles have been removed in part way. But you talk about the so-called oppression of the patriarchy. But
Yes.
Women were oppressed for centuries. I mean,
Well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that men and women were oppressed for centuries. I mean, there are certain burdens that women bore